Yo, 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 yo. Good good mid-afternoon. Good mid-afternoon. It's 3:45 here in Minnesota, man. How's everybody doing? Hope everybody's in good spirits, man. Start by pushing that fucking positive energy, all that good shit, man. I hope everybody out there chasing their goals. I hope everybody makes some money. Hope everybody's on the right side of the bed this morning. I know it's Monday and it's sometimes hard, motherfucker, but we're here. We're here. You're alive. Be thankful, be grateful, motherfucking, to be breathing out in this motherfucker, because a lot of people ain't. So, now that we got that out the way, oh my goodness, another nail has went in the coffin of Derek Chauvin. Now, it appears that the Minneapolis police chief decided to speak his mind or speak what he knows when it comes to the trial. They went over policy and they went over the use of force, all that stuff. So I want to get into it right away. I don't want to waste no time. Because all this stuff is important, man. And I made a vow to cover this fucking trial in these streams, and I want to make sure that I cover them for the people that's here, because it's important. It should be important to y'all just as much as it is to me. So let's listen to what the fuck happened. Also, if you got some shit to roll up, roll that shit up right now, man. Smoke some shit.
For the jury, the different bullets that you see here.
Yes, some of the bullets here for de-escalation tactics.
Calm it down.
Oh,
JG, what's happening?
all right. Thank you. All right. Please resume.
Yes, some of the de-escalation tactics that are noted here include but are not limited to placing barriers between an uncooperative subject and an officer, communication from a safe position intended to gain the subject's compliance using verbal persuasion, advisements, or warnings, using verbal techniques to calm an agitated subject and promote rational decision-making, calling for additional resources to assist, including more officers, CIT officers, and officers equipped with less lethal tools.
And CIT officers are those who've been through the crisis intervention training course. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And our Minneapolis police officers then at the training center taught different techniques on how to implement this policy.
That is correct.
Have you personally attended the training?
Yes, I have.
GG4, I
Did
see
you find it useful?
I have.
And you could remove that. We've talked a little bit then about behavioral crises and identifying behavioral crises. How does the Minneapolis Police Department respond to persons in a behavioral crisis?
One of the first important things is obviously trying to get as much information prior to the call as possible. But as soon as officers at least have knowledge that this could be a potential situation with that caller, this de-escalation piece should kick in. And that they, while they may not know exactly what they're going to encounter when they arrive on the scene, this body of knowledge that they've been taught should at least be kind of forefront in terms of the different tools that they'll be using possibly to help de-escalate that situation.
What is an EDP? What is that acronym?
The acronym
Good afternoon,
EDP,
everybody. Hit that like button.
Is labeled through our Minneapolis Emergency Communications Center as a emotionally disturbed person. And so when our Minneapolis police officers receive a EDP call, that is prompting them that there's at least initial information that they're going to be responding to someone who may be in crisis.
And that's something that the officer would then be communicated by a dispatcher prior to going to the scene, correct?
That is correct.
However, when if that information is not imparted upon them, they make their own assessment at the scene as to whether the person could potentially be an EDP. Is that correct?
That is correct.
You indicated that the Minneapolis Police Department receives over 100,000 calls a year, calls for service. Is that right?
Yes.
Do you have an idea of how many calls for service involve people in crisis?
I believe in 2019, Minneapolis police officers responded to
That was weird.
about 4,500 of those signified as EDP calls. Yes.
Did y'all see that? Did y'all realize what the fuck just happened to the viewership? YouTube fucking with me again. They start jumping, and then all of a sudden it just disappeared. That was weird as fuck. I think they trying to stop the stream. I think they trying to put me back in the shadows. Don't let them.
In terms of teaching officers how to recognize a person who may potentially be in crisis and therefore unable to comply with commands, you place these different signs into MPD policy.
That is correct.
And I'd like to direct your attention now to Exhibit 231 and ask that to be published. And this is 7-809, the crisis intervention policy. You say it begins here. Oops, sorry. But we'll go ahead and over to page 2. And I'd like to highlight, please, for the jury, the definition of a crisis. And again, in the definition of a crisis under MPD policy, generally speaking, we're talking about some of the same things that we saw before in the de-escalation policy. Is that right?
That is correct.
There can be mental illness. Is that right?
Yes.
Substance abuse can be a crisis or a barrier to communication, correct?
Yes.
And same with various stressors. Is that right?
Yes.
And then
You
further,
got to
if
see
you
it, cookies
could,
and cream?
emphasize the crisis intervention definition. And officers, when they either respond to an
I
EDP
haven't seen it
call
yet. I'm
or
excited to see
are
what he about to
aware
do.
that the person may be in crisis, can attempt a crisis intervention method. Is that correct?
Yes.
And generally speaking, what is the officer supposed to do to a person in crisis?
It's an attempt to de-escalate that situation.
And the policy then of the Minneapolis Police Department in handling persons in crisis, if we could look at section 3 of the policy, would be the next page. Highlight Roman 3. Okay, in accordance with the Minneapolis Police Departmental
What's good,
policy,
Jay?
what are officers supposed to do? How are they supposed to handle encounters with individuals who are experiencing a crisis?
We really want to, again, we want to meet people where they are. We want to bring our values, and our principles to those situations. We recognize that oftentimes people who are experiencing crisis, it is not something that they brought on themselves, but they're dealing with. And so there's a sense of dignity and respect that we should be honoring when we come to those calls. And so, as it's mentioned here, the values of protection, safety, and sanctity of life. Oftentimes, again, we are that first face of government that they're going to see. That may be 3 o'clock in the morning. And so we have to wear many hats, but we want to be respectful in that care that we're trying to provide for that individual.
And sometimes persons might be experiencing some sort of a breakdown that, maybe they did partially bring upon themselves. Is that right?
That is correct.
And are those people still entitled to be treated in accordance with MPD policy?
Yes, they are.
That's a fact. They be hating on me like a motherfucker, man.
And this policy, again, is imparted in training at the training center.
I'm trying to keep people aware.
That is correct.
They fucking with me.
Now, I'd like to, if you could take that down, please, talk to you a little bit about officers' role as first responders in terms of providing basic medical care. All right? And so, with that, can you tell the jury, are Minneapolis police officers trained to provide basic medical care?
Yes, we are.
Can you please describe what what level? I'm aware there are various different levels of medical care that someone could be trained in.
So most of department members will have at least basic training in terms of first responder, the ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation, the effects of applying direct pressure on wounds to stop bleeding. Many of the things that we will respond to, perhaps just because we're closer to a call than perhaps our EMS or fire before they get
Take
there.
it
And they're
easy, Cook.
obviously have a higher degree level of training. But the training that we have and that we receive, it's very vital because those seconds are vital. Our officers carry tourniquets. We respond to situations where members in our community will have gunshot wounds. And matter of fact, a couple of my officers a couple of weeks ago saved a young man who was shot in the femur and was bleeding profusely, but because they got there quickly, knew how to apply that tourniquet. Those are some of the basics. Baby not breathing calls. Our officers have saved the lives of children who've choked or what have you because they've applied or they've been able to help start emergency breathing for them. So those are some of the basic types of first aid that are chest compressions, those types of basic first aid.
And our officers
I
then,
like how he did that. He made sure he
specifically
said chest
trained at the
compressions
training
last.
center to provide this basic sort of first aid.
That is correct.
And does the Minneapolis Police Department have a policy regarding any duty that an officer would have to apply that training to a real life situation?
Yes. We recognize, again, I mentioned that we are oftentimes going to be the first ones to respond to someone who needs medical attention, and so we absolutely have a duty to render that aid.
And that, of course, is in the policy and procedure manual, is that right?
Yes.
If I can display Exhibit 230, which is MPD Policy 7-350. Emergency medical response. And under Roman 1, you see that the purpose of the policy is to lay out in writing the roles and responsibilities of Minneapolis Police Department employees in incidents involving a medical emergency. Is that right?
Yes.
If we could take a look at the policy itself under Roman 2, does that explain what a Minneapolis police officer is supposed to do when they come upon a medical emergency or a medical emergency develops on a call?
Yes.
What are they supposed to do?
While awaiting EMS, MPD employees assisting an individual having an acute medical crisis shall provide any necessary first aid consistent with our MPD training as soon as practical.
And so then that presumes, of course, they're waiting for EMS or waiting for some kind of emergency services. Is that right?
That is correct.
So would it be fair to say that this policy then is in two parts? The officer has to request EMS or an ambulance, correct?
Yes.
And while waiting for the ambulance, they're required to provide what medical training and skills they have to attempt to save the person.
That is correct.
Come on, man. I mean, we all know it was wrong what the fuck Derek Chauvin did, but I mean,
Minneapolis police officers provided.
I like the fact that they're making this shit technical for the ones that want to sit back and use the drug shit as a way of justifying the murder. Like, we're talking about somebody who you want to uphold. You talking about Blue Lives Matter. What the fuck does it matter if these motherfuckers ain't going by policy? Now, the first thing motherfuckers want to do is be like, oh, if you just comply, if you just listen, if you do what they say, if you're not resisting. But these motherfuckers ain't doing shit by the book either. This is the shit that they're supposed to be trained for. But they putting it out there for people who can't. And I would love for the same people who are trying to justify George Floyd's death to sit up here and justify not going by the book or going by their own policy, breaking their own policy and doing shit they knew was wrong. Doing shit they knew was wrong. Oh, but he was on drugs. Yeah, get the fuck out of here.
Oxone or Narcan kits.
Yes, we are.
What are those?
It is basically a inhaler for community members who we may respond to have overdosed. It is to, if they've overdosed and are out, it is to give them that inhaler injection so that they can hopefully come to. And so it was a few years ago where, for the most part, our Minneapolis Fire Department were the ones that responded to overdose and carried the Narcan. Unfortunately, in our cities across the country saw an uptick in
What's good, Cliff?
heroin and opioid overdoses. We had to make sure that we were, again, because we were oftentimes the first ones to come across these situations, we wanted to make sure that we were in service to our communities and making sure that if we could save lives, that we were equipping our folks with Narcan.
And a policy developed as a result of this, is that right?
That is correct.
If I can show you Exhibit 229, it's published that. Is this the Narcan policy 7-348?
That is correct, yes.
And our officers provided training in the administration of Narcan
Yes,
under appropriate circumstances.
yes.
Okay. And now I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the use of force.
Here we
Does,
go.
Minneapolis have a written policy governing proper and authorized use of force?
Yes, we do.
And is this generally covered in the 5-300 series of the Policy and Procedure Manual?
Yes, it is.
I'd like to discuss some of that manual with you and the policy with you at this time. If we could pull and display Exhibit 216. Under the purpose of the policy, which is 5-301, can you please read the first sentence under subparagraph A?
Yes. Sanctity of life and the protection of the public shall be the cornerstones of the MPD's use of force policy.
What does that mean?
Of all the things that we do as peace officers for the Minneapolis Police Department, and I mentioned the thousands of calls that our men and women respond to, it is my firm belief that the one singular incident we will be judged forever on will be our use of force. And so, while it is absolutely imperative that our officers go home at the end of their shift, we want to make sure and ensure that our community members go home too. And so sanctity of life is absolutely vital, that is the pillar for our use of force.
Has this generally always been the case with Minneapolis use of force policy?
It is not.
When did that change?
We implemented this particular in 2016.
Whoa.
Has the training and use of force and application of use of force policy been imparted, including this
That should have been
philosophy,
in place from day
onto
one.
police officers in training at the training center?
It certainly has, yes.
Does the policy itself define force? What is force?
Yes, it does.
If we could take a look at Exhibit 217, I'll publish that. If you'd highlight use of force. Generally speaking, what is force?
It can be any physical contact. It can be with a weapon. It could be with a vehicle. But it's any sort of physical contact that is more likely to render harm or injury to someone.
This is the chief.
Is a restraint,
Minneapolis
is
Police
the use of
Chief.
restraint considered force?
That would be considered.
Sorry, I did not. I'm sorry. I was high in the beginning of this. Listen, he is talking to the Minneapolis Police Chief, Chief Arredondo. This is somebody very important. He is about to put another nail in the coffin, just like the lieutenant did.
Force.
And what type of force is authorized under departmental policy?
We under 609, we operate under the use of force, the Graham v. Connor statute, objectively reasonable force.
And if I could display Exhibit 217. Let's see. First, go back to 5-303. 5-303 authorizes force, is that right? And you mentioned 60906, state statute authorizing force under certain circumstances, is that right?
Yes.
And the phrase that's used for the authorization of force is what type of force?
Reasonable.
And that force can be authorized under certain circumstances, is that right?
Yes.
All right. So now if you would go to the next page, and let's talk about the circumstances under which a police officer is authorized properly to use force. If you highlight that. What are the circumstances under which an officer is authorized to use force?
An officer is authorized to use force affecting a lawful arrest, executing a legal process, enforcing an order of the court, and any other duties imposed upon that officer.
And that term reasonable force is further delineated in the policy, is that right?
Yes.
If we take a look at Exhibit 217, I believe under the definition, objectively reasonable force. Could you please read that definition?
Yes. The amount and type of force that would be considered rational and logical to an objective officer on the scene, supported by facts and circumstances known to an officer at the time the force was used.
Oh, you discussed a case, the Connor, right? The Connor factors. And I'd like you to, well, first of all, does the policy reference the Connor factors that you just mentioned?
Yes.
If you could display 217, page 2.
These fucking
And
long
we
ass
have
policies and shit.
3 bullet points here under the Connor factors. And that is the officer is supposed to look at the totality of the circumstances, right?
Yes.
And the 3 bullets here that the officer is supposed to consider are what?
The officer should consider the severity of the crime at issue, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officers or others, and whether he is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight.
And fair to say these 3 different considerations are things that you can attribute to the subject, correct?
Yes.
That's the subject's conduct, not someone else's.
Yes.
It seems.
And of course, it has to be judged by a reasonable police officer on the scene at the time, correct?
Yes.
It seems.
Now, do you recall, and obviously you're here talking about what happened on May 25, 2020, involving George Floyd. Do you recall why the officers were responding to Cup Foods on that date? The original reason for the call?
The original reason for the call was a response regarding a counterfeit situation at the store at the intersection of 38th and Chicago.
And in terms of
Not at all, Ish.
the deployment of your resources at the Minneapolis Police Department and as chief, how do you rate, I guess, the severity of that offense, the seriousness of that offense?
It would probably not rise to the level of, and particularly in light of last year, the level of violent crime that we've experienced in the city, but we would certainly respond to it, but it would not rise to the level in terms of severity of the crime here.
In looking at the particular type of crime, is that one for which a suspect is typically taken into a custodial arrest?
Typically not.
Ooh.
Why is that?
Whoa.
If it's not a
Whoa.
violent felony, we also in
That's big.
coordination with our jail system and our courts, there's been a shift over the years to make sure that the individuals who are going to jail are those who, from a public safety standpoint, need to be at least in that facility in the Hennepin County Jail. And if we can properly identify and it's not a violent situation, we can always charge via complaint and other things. And so that's one of the reasons why.
You use
That's very
the
big,
phrase,
y'all.
I guess, violent felony. What's the more important part, whether it's violent or whether it's a felony?
violence.
Why is that?
Well, it can certainly endanger not only the officers but the community.
Where something that's merely labeled a felony may or may not require a full custodial arrest.
That is correct.
And are Minneapolis police officers trained in the use of force?
Yes.
In the pre-service, in the academy, and also in post-service at the in-service training?
Yes.
And are officers taught the standard that force must be reasonable at the time it is applied?
Yes.
The entire time it's applied?
Yes.
Are officers taught the need to assess and reassess and reevaluate situations in the field?
Yes, we are.
Are you familiar with Minneapolis Police Department's critical thinking model?
Yes.
How are you familiar with that?
It was something that I wanted to embark and make sure that it was part of our training curriculum that also includes the aspects of procedural justice. And procedural justice is really, it's actually research and evidence-based learning that has shown that if police departments treat people with respect, give them voice, establish neutral engagements, and build areas of trust, our communities are more likely to cooperate with us. We're likely to be seen more as legitimate. It is actually shown that our employees are come to work, their wellness is better, and so this is very important work. And so it's part of that procedural justice I just mentioned, is part of that critical thinking in our training.
At this time, I'd ask to display only to the witness exhibit for identification 276. Sir, do you recognize exhibit 276 as being MPD's critical decision-making model?
Yes.
Offer exhibit 276.
Any objection? No objection. 276 is received.
Permission to publish. So
Did they try to object that shit?
we heard about the model. Now we get to
They
actually
are
see it.
fucking
And if you
trash.
could enlarge
Defense is
the
fucking
graphic,
trash.
please. All right, so this is what the model looks like. It's sort of a wheel. Is that right?
Yes.
And the first stage of the critical thinking model, decision-making model, is information gathering.
Yes.
Explain that, please.
It's very vital. We rely upon trying to gather as much information as possible so that we can try our best to effectively go in, respond, and manage that situation. Trying to gather as much information at the onset is very important, but we also need to make sure that we're continuing to try to gather as much information as we're dealing with the scene or the call.
Now, I see the arrow points in two directions. In one, it points to the middle of the circle, voice, neutrality, respect, and trust. And the other arrow points to the threat or risk assessment. Let's talk about the middle of the circle first. Right? What is that middle circle supposed to be representing?
Well, that's the principles, really, of what continues to guide us. So, for example, information gathering, while we may associate it specifically with receiving a 911 call and the dispatcher giving us information, but information gathering could be that officers come across a call that they weren't dispatched to and they need to talk to a community member. If they don't treat that community member with respect or give them voice, it's likely that they will receive less information that will be less helpful in them resolving that call. So that voice, neutrality, respect, and trust, that has to guide and be a part of all of that critical decision-making model.
So let's go to the next step. The officers gathered some initial information, and now the officer is in a position to need to think about it or assess it. Is that right?
Yes.
And so the next step is the threat or risk assessment. Is there a difference between a threat and a risk?
There can be in terms of what is being played out at the time, and you're constantly evaluating that, and of course the information that you're receiving which may be fluid, is going to dictate that threat or risk. Yes.
And so then once the officer has made an assessment of a threat or a risk, the next step, authority to act, what does that mean?
That may mean the officer now, based upon that the information that they've received, evaluating that threat or risk, am I going to act? Is this going to be a physical arrest? Am I going to separate parties? Does this require a report? All of these things. So, but it's giving more information for the officer to guide he or she in terms of what is the next appropriate step they need to act and take.
And so if we were to, at least to this point in the model, put a scenario into action, information gathering, the officer perceives that someone is approaching them with a weapon, like a bat, right? And so then they would reflect on that and determine whether or not this is a risk. It's a bat, maybe the person is at a baseball game, or a threat. The bat is being brandished, correct?
Yes.
Then after that, under authority to act, if they've determined that this in fact is a risk and that they're being threatened, they would look at the authority back to the MPD policy and procedural manual. Is that right?
Yes.
Under what is the use of force policy, what tools are available to me to respond here?
Yes.
Right? The next step then, after considering the authority to act, goals and actions. What is that?
The goals. The officer is making an assessment. So with the authority to act, will an arrest resolve this situation? Will separating the two parties be enough? Is taking a report, will that be enough of a goal or an action? It may mean a combination of things. It may mean that I'm going to have to, or the officers are going to have to make an arrest, but we may need additional resources here because the situation is still could have the potential to not be stabilized. And so all of that is part of that goals and action.
And then to review and reassess, assuming that means exactly what it says.
Exactly. Yes. And information is going to flow. Dynamics can change, and so it can be a constant just review and reassess the situation to make sure that we're trying to get to the best possible outcome in this peacefully and safely.
Because circumstances can change, the situation can change, correct?
Yes.
And force that might be appropriate at one moment might not be appropriate at a different moment, or more force might be needed at yet another point. Is that right?
Yes.
Cover all those aspects.
Particular critical thinking model, Exhibit 276. We see examples of this throughout training materials that are provided by the trainers at the facility. Is that right?
Yes.
And why is that?
It's to really embed that knowledge that we don't want to fall susceptible to kind of check the box training. This training is important for all of our officers to have a knowledge and understanding of, and that our community members can expect this to be consistent as they have encounters or engagements with our officers.
All right. If we could take that down, please. And I want to shift a little bit to talk about, we've talked about use of force and the policy. Does Minneapolis... All right. If we could take that down, please. And I want to shift a little bit to talk about, we're more with the neck restraint with the intent to control, but not to render the subject unconscious. Is that right?
Yes.
By applying light to moderate pressure. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
This is what I wanted y'all to see. Neck restraint, not deadly force option, defined as compressing one or both sides of a person's neck with an arm or leg without applying direct pressure to the trachea or airway, front of the neck. Only sworn employees who have received training from the MPD training unit are authorized to use neck restraints. The MPD authorizes two types of neck restraints: conscious neck restraint and unconscious neck restraint.
And if you could go to Roman 2 on the same policy.
That's crazy.
Highlight that. Okay. conscious neck restraint can be used for someone who is actively resisting, correct?
Yes.
And an unconscious neck restraint could be used for a person who is exhibiting active aggression or to save a person's life. Is that right?
Yes.
Or in a subject who is exhibiting active resistance if lesser attempts would have or would likely to be ineffective. Is that right?
Yes.
But neck restraints were not to be used against persons who were merely passively resisting. Correct?
That is correct.
All right. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to May 25, 2020.
Let's get it.
Can you tell the jury when you first learned of the incident involving the defendant, officers Tao, Lane, and King, and George Floyd?
On Monday evening, around 9 p.m., back on May 25th, 2020, I received a call. I was at my residence, and I received a call from one of my, I believe it was a deputy chief, who had informed me that Minneapolis police officers had responded to 38th in Chicago, and while attempting to take someone into custody, that, which I learned now to be Mr. Floyd, they believed that he would not make it or survive. And so he was being transported via ambulance to, at that time, Hennepin County Medical Center. And while, at least the information I had that evening at 9 p.m., he at that time at least I was told was still alive, I decided to contact the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension.
I'll answer that in a second.
And they are a state agency that conducts our critical incidents. I deemed that this would be a critical incident, and it has been our protocol to alert them, and they would conduct that investigation. So,
or maybe
I
somebody
made
can
that
answer
call
Ishbay's question.
to the
Who knows?
BCA to
In
have
chat.
them start to conduct this critical incident.
Did you then proceed to City Hall?
I should also say that I, right after that call, I notified Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Fry to say that this is a situation we have at least right now, and that I would brief him as I received more information. I then proceeded to leave my residence, and I went directly to my office in City Hall.
When you arrived at City Hall, do you recall seeing any video images or footage of this event?
The first time that I saw a video of the event was after I was notified that Mr. Floyd was now deceased. And so I had asked my deputy chief to pull up knowing the area really well and knowing that there's usually a camera, a city-owned camera at that location, I asked him to locate that video so that I could review it.
Okay. And that's what we would refer to as the milestone camera or milestone footage?
That is correct.
Okay. Did you watch the footage from the milestone camera that evening?
I did watch that.
Okay. Can you describe for the jury what you saw when you watched the footage?
When I first viewed this milestone video, what I was able to see,
It's
and I
gonna be
should just
interesting.
note that it was from a distance from where the officers were with Mr. Floyd, and so all I could really see were the back sides of the officers. There was also no audio to this milestone video, and so I viewed that video in its entirety, and quite frankly, there was really nothing in terms of the actions of at least, again, this non-audio video that really jumped out at me. After a few minutes, it seemed, a paramedics vehicle pulled up to the scene, and it was at that time, for the first time, that I saw a glimpse of Mr. Floyd when paramedics placed his body on the gurney and transported him away from the scene. But that was really my first observation of that incident from that night.
At some point, did you become aware of another video that had been taken by a bystander?
Yes, probably close to midnight, a community member had contacted me and said, Chief, almost verbatim, but said, Chief, have you seen the video of your officer choking and killing that man at 38th in Chicago? And so once I heard that statement, I just knew it wasn't the same milestone camera video.
You catch that? So Ish asked, will the other officers be on trial? My guy JR said they are charged for aiding, but their trials are separate from Chauvin. So they'll be on
that
trial.
I saw. And eventually, within minutes after that, I saw for the first time what is now known as the bystander video.
Fair to say that this was a much closer video and it had audio?
Yes, this I was able to see the occurrence, see the officers involved. I was able to actually see Mr. Floyd. I was actually able to hear what was occurring, and I was also able to get a better understanding of the length of time, the duration of the call, the incident. Yes.
Now, prior to testifying today, have you now reviewed the bystander video, Facebook video in its entirety?
Yes, I have.
You've also reviewed and reviewed milestone footage?
Yes, I have.
And have you reviewed the body-worn camera footage worn by officers Tao, King, Lane, and the defendant?
Yes,
It's
I have.
important. Listen up.
Now, first, I want to show you what's been received as Exhibit 17. Do you recognize Exhibit 17 to be an image taken from the bystander video that you reviewed?
Yes, I do.
Now, sir, based upon your review of all of the information that you just mentioned, do you believe that the defendant followed departmental policy 5-304 regarding de-escalation?
I absolutely do not agree with that.
And how so?
That action is not de-escalation. And when we talk about the framework of our sanctity of life, and when we talk about the principles and values that we have, that action goes contrary to what we're taught.
As you reflect on Exhibit 17, I must ask you, is this a trained Minneapolis Police Department defensive tactics technique?
It is not.
Well, we read the departmental policy on neck restraints. Is this a neck restraint?
The conscious neck restraint by policy mentions light to moderate pressure. When I look at Exhibit 17, and when I look at the facial expression of Mr. Floyd, that does not appear in any way, shape, or form that is light to moderate pressure.
Boom.
So is it your belief then that this particular form of restraint, if that's what we'll call it, in fact violates departmental policy?
I absolutely agree that violates our policy.
Are you aware now that the defendant maintained this position on George Floyd for 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
I am aware of that.
I believe you testified that force has to be reasonable when it's applied at the beginning and through the entire encounter. Is that right?
That is correct.
Is what you see in Exhibit 17, in your opinion, within Minneapolis Police Departmental Policy 5-300, authorizing the use of reasonable force?
It is not.
And why not?
That is, it has to be objectively reasonable.
Oh
We
my
have to
God.
take into account the circumstances, information, the threat to the officer, the threat to others, and the severity of that. So that is not part of our policy. That is not what we teach, and that should be condoned.
When do you believe, or do you have a belief as to when this restraint, the restraint on the ground that you viewed, should have stopped?
Once Mr. Floyd, and this is based on my viewing of the videos, once Mr. Floyd had stopped resisting, and certainly once he was in distress and trying to verbalize that, that should have stopped. There's
That right there, y'all. Listen. I have expressed this multiple times. I have been waiting for someone to say during this trial that George Floyd verbally expressed what was happening to him before he died. It is so important, because if he didn't, if George would have just been struggling and just yelling and screaming, then their drug defense could probably stick, because he wouldn't have said it out of his mouth what was killing him. But George, that's why I was like, yo, I think even though George's life is gone, I thank God that he had enough strength and enough breath left to at least verbally say what was going on and what was killing him at that moment. That's why literally I told myself over the past few days, I'm not responding to nobody else bringing up anything about drugs, because I know 99.9% of anybody bringing up drugs is either on them or has loved ones that are on drugs right now. And if it was them in this situation, dealing with one of their family members being killed, and then having a bunch of people try to say that it was the drugs that they took, when there's video evidence of that person getting killed, I'm not responding to any of these motherfuckers anymore. He said exactly what happened to him. He said it. He spoke it. He had enough breath before it was taken from him to say exactly what happened. So I'm so glad that the police chief said that shit, because I haven't heard it yet. And that's some important ass shit.
There's an initial reasonableness in trying to just get him under control in the first few seconds, but once there was no longer any resistance, and clearly,
Look at that. They're trying to fuck up the audio.
No longer responsive and even motionless, to continue to apply that level of force to a person proned out, handcuffed behind their back, that in no way, shape, or form is anything that is by policy.
Say
it's
that
not
shit.
part of our training.
Yep.
And it is certainly not part of our ethics or our values.
Let's go.
Sir, based on your review of the video and based on your own experience and training as an MPD officer, did you see signs during the encounter that Mr. Floyd was exhibiting indicia of being in medical distress?
Yes. Yes.
Hey, I know there's going to be a fucking farm of white people talking about how because he's black, that's why he's saying this shit. But guess what? You the same motherfuckers that said Blue Lives Matter, right? This is your blue life right here. This is your blue life that matters. And he's saying what's going on. He's saying what happened. Let me see how many Blue Lives Matter motherfuckers exist after this.
And you saw at one point, I think you just testified that
Ooh, I
Mr.
love
Floyd was unresponsive.
That is correct.
This isn't Fiji water. These are white tears.
That officers, we were aware that officers couldn't find a pulse.
Could you repeat that, sir?
And were you aware that officers at the time of the restraint were unable to find a pulse,
Yes, I was aware of that.
and so stated?
I was aware that the officers were not able to find a pulse, yes.
Did you see,
Fucking up the audio.
were any of the officers attempt to provide first aid to Mr. Floyd?
I did not see any of the defendants try to attempt to provide first aid to Mr. Floyd.
The defendant did not try CPR. He did not start chest compressions.
Objection, argumentative, and
Sustained.
Argumentative? Objection? Off of asking him what he saw the officer not do that we all saw the officer not do? He's asking him, he's saying, hey, during that fucking video, you didn't see him doing any of the shit that I'm asking you. Objection, argumentative. Yeah, you better stop that shit.
Is leading. Rephrase.
Better stop that shit.
Did you see them provide any medical attention?
I did not.
Then, based on these observations, do you have an opinion as to whether the defendant violated MPD departmental policy 7-350 by failing to render aid to Mr. Floyd?
I agree that the defendant violated our policy in terms of rendering aid.
Ah,
Thank you.
Oh, I love
I have
it.
no further questions at this time, Your Honor.
I love it.
Oh, I just love when a plan comes together.
Let's go. Look at that. The audio keep fucking up on the video. They just like, yo, this nigga's fucking up, man. He's fucking it up, man. We supposed to be letting this motherfucker get off. He's ruining it. Why does the police chief have to be a black guy? I'm telling you.
Chief Arredondo,
Good afternoon, Counselor.
thank you for being here this afternoon and this morning.
Thank you.
A few follow-up questions for you
Here come the
regarding
bitch-ass
this
defense.
incident. Your determinations today are in reference to employment policies and Mr. Chauvin's actions violating the departmental employment policies, correct?
My man got a
That is
peanut
correct.
butter ball head.
Now, as the police chief, I assume that you're not out on the street day-to-day arresting people.
That is correct.
Look,
Can you just-
this stupid motherfucker, yo. See, now I'm not gonna lie. I hate the defense, but I love when he comes up because I love poking holes in everything he starts to say because he always starts out with some bullshit. He did this to the lieutenant. He did this to the lieutenant last week. When the lieutenant came up there, he tried to say, so you've been in this position for how many years? So it's fair to say that you haven't worked the streets in a while. He's trying to, he doesn't even understand what he's doing. He's trying to demonize not just the South Side, but black neighborhoods, period. That's what he's trying to start off doing because he's making them seem so fucking dangerous, so fucking, and I get it. There's a level of danger. There's a level of fucking violence. There's a level of all that shit in all across America. But we are talking about what your client, the nigga sitting next to you, we talking about what he did. We not talking about what happens on the streets. We not talking about deadly anything. George Floyd didn't do anything that was deadly or fucking intimidating or motherfucking a threat to nobody. So we're not talking about anything that has to do with street violence. But see, this is the view that these type of motherfuckers have. This is how they view us. This is how they view black neighborhoods. This is how they view black people. There's no trick behind it. And motherfuckers don't like when motherfuckers use race, but it's clear what the fuck is happening, how he's bringing that up. This is the first thing he brought up. He's not bringing up his credentials. He's not bringing up the actual incident last year. He's bringing up, oh, it's fair to say you haven't been on the streets.
Give me a general sense, when's the last time you've actually, I don't mean to be dismissive, but actually arrested a suspect?
It's been many years, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
Your role as the Minneapolis police chief is sort of grander in its scope, right? I mean,
It's large in context and the operations of the department, yes.
And part of that job is to be sort of aware of issues in policing, kind of policy changes, use of force changes. All of these things fall under the umbrella of your role as the chief. Agreed?
Yes.
And you're sort of the general in a sense, right? Formulating the plan for your police department.
And delegating some of those to our subject matter experts, yes.
He's disrespecting this man's fucking profession.
When you talk about training of a police officer, you would also include the training that the Minneapolis Police Department.
Hold up 1 second. First of all, like this video if you haven't liked the video. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell if you haven't. I have one question. One quick question. This is totally off the subject before we continue the video. If I should roll up another joint, please put GMS in the chat. GMS. Just put GMS in the chat. And if you do that, I'll roll up another joint right now. But let's get back to the important shit. I'm sorry. I'll be high. I'll be trying to just do that.
Goes through. But you may go to other trainings.
What's up, Bars?
Out of state.
Ben
listen
Slim.
to speakers talking about issues that confront policing, right?
Yes.
As well as maybe a homicide detective will get permission to travel to an interviewing a suspect type of a training in some other state or location, right?
Yes.
And so there is a variability within the training depending upon your role as in the police department, right?
Yes.
So that you've got sort of your rank and file basic patrol officers, and they go through all of the trainings that you've described, the defensive tactics, medical assistance or basic medical training, crisis intervention, things that we've been talking about here today, right?
Yes.
And then the investigative type officers, they may go to some they have to go through that training, but they may go through some additional training in terms of how to interview suspects or how to properly collect evidence, etc., unique to their role, right?
Yes.
And then you as the police chief or those who are in the more management or administrative side of the police department, you go to the kind of the big picture training sometimes.
That's correct.
All right. So I want to review with you a few of the policies that we've already talked about today. We can take this down for the moment, Your Honor.
Take your time, defense. I know it's hard and struggling.
First
have
of
a
all,
defense for
I'd
something
like
like this.
to show you what has been introduced
take your
as
time.
Exhibit 216-216, which is the use of force policy for the City of Minneapolis Police Department.
Yes.
We've discussed this. And I know that kind of what we did a little earlier is we kind of jumped around from part to part, but I'd like to walk through some of these issues in a little bit more linear fashion, if we could. So you've described under policy 5-301.01 that the Fourth Amendment's reasonableness standard applies to the use of force in Minneapolis, of the Minneapolis Police Department. Agreed?
Yes.
And that goes on to say that MPD employees shall only use the amount of force that is objectively reasonable, and it continues in light of the facts and circumstances known to that employee.
It's
at
hard to
the time
defend
the
something
force
when
is
it's
used.
actually wrong.
Correct?
Yes.
So the
He gotta take his time.
reasonableness standard,
Come up with
or
some
the
bullshit.
objectively reasonable standard, applies to the facts and circumstances that are known by the officer at the time the force is being used. Correct?
Yes.
Now, 5-302 gives some definitions in terms of the use of force, and it differentiates between active aggression and active resistance. Can you describe the difference between active aggression and active resistance?
Active aggression, behavior initiated by the subject that may or may not be in response to police efforts to bring the person into custody or control. the act of aggression when presenting behaviors that constitute an assault, or in the circumstances reasonably indicate that an assault or an injury to any person is likely to occur at any moment. That's
So
for
let me-
active aggression.
Yep, let me just stop you there. That's active aggression. So that's where a suspect is essentially fighting with a police officer or doing something that
Essentially.
is aggressive
Pay attention to those
behaviorally
words.
speaking.
Pay attention to those type of words. Essentially. He couldn't just say fighting because George couldn't fight nobody. He had his hands handcuffed behind his back. He wasn't fighting. He may have been resisting, but he wasn't fighting. So he has to say essentially fighting.
Agreed?
Yes,
And that is aggressive in its nature.
yes.
Now, can you read active resistance?
Active resistance is a response to police efforts to bring a person into custody or control for detainment or arrest. Subject engages in active resistance when engaging in physical actions or verbal behavior reflecting an intention to make it more difficult for officers to achieve actual physical control.
So essentially, what we're talking about here is behavior that may or may not be physical in its nature that simply makes it harder for an officer to take a person into custody. Agreed?
Yes.
And sometimes that is maybe not trying to punch the officer, but pulling away or hiding his arms or doing something that just makes it more difficult physically, right?
Yes.
And sometimes it's, you're not going to take me alive, you dirty cop. You know, like they're saying something to.
How's that? How can you say something like that in court as a fucking, as a lawyer, as a defense? You're not going to take me, you dirty cop. Like, he's really trying to paint the picture of George Floyd being a bad person when he's not. Like, he literally said in the video, George literally said in the video, I'm not a bad guy. Not once did he fucking say anything disrespectful or anything foul to the police in those videos. From what I saw, he was pleading with them motherfuckers. He was trying to plead with them. He literally said out of his mouth, "I'm not a bad guy." So what is this nigga talking about? Like, he looks crazy right now. There's video, man. What are you doing?
To
The
prevent
defense
the
is
officer
trash.
from arresting.
Yes.
Right? So they're using their words, they're using their behaviors. Is it common, based upon your experience, for people to enjoy being taken into custody?
No.
Do people like to be arrested?
Typically not.
Right. And in your experience, is it common practice for people whom are being arrested to say things in an effort to try to get the officer to not arrest them?
That certainly occurs, yes.
Right. My mom is homesick. I need to get home to my kids. There may be words that they use to try to convince an officer to not arrest
What's all these what
Right.
ifs,
Yes.
man?
Now, you would also agree that there is a difference between being arrested and being detained. Agreed?
There can be,
Right.
yes.
So an officer in certain circumstances is permitted to expand the scope of the original intervention. Would you agree with that?
Objection.
You could restate.
Let me try. When an officer approaches a situation, and let's assume it's a relatively minor offense, is it possible that that minor offense can grow in its scope of investigation?
Yes.
And it's actually quite common for that to happen, correct?
Yes.
An officer makes a traffic stop for speeding or something like that, smells drugs in the car, searches the car, finds a large amount of drugs, finds guns, etc., right?
Yes.
So what starts out as a relatively minor incident, a traffic ticket, can turn into a felony.
Ain't been no real objections to this shit besides the one that just came. Ain't been no real objections because they listened. They probably just objected a minute ago just to do it for fun because they hear how stupid he sounds. Like, none of this shit applies to the George Floyd incident. None of it applies. If the prosecution was saying this shit, them niggas would have been over there screaming and busting blood vessels to say objection because it don't make no sense. Also, please remember, like, he's staying away as much as he can, as much as possible from the actual incident, which is why this nigga looks like this right now. He's like, yeah, you could ask me all these questions. I'm going to answer them truthfully, just like I'll answer any fucking question, because this has nothing to do with your client being a murderer. Like, he literally has that face. Like, look at his face. His face says that. His face says right now, hey, what you're asking me is completely irrelevant to your client being a murderer. But I'm going to answer them because I know this is court, and I know you punk ass motherfuckers will get mad if I don't.
Felony arrest, correct?
It could.
And that, again, happens quite regularly.
Yes.
So when an officer, well, let me back up a second. You would agree that being a police officer is a pretty dangerous profession.
No.
There are inherent dangers with it.
I've never had to get in a fight with anybody in my life, in my job, right? But in your job, it's probably more.
I can see that. He had to correct himself, but what he said the first time was correct. He's never gotten into a fight ever in his life.
More probable that that will happen. Would you
Yes.
agree with that? Now, talking about the use of force, when an officer approaches a motor vehicle, is that considered to be one of the most dangerous initiations of contact between an officer and a citizen?
I don't have the exact statistics on it. It's certainly an encounter that officers are certainly more heightened. I know that domestic response calls can also have a sense of heightened awareness for officers, but it's certainly something, a traffic stop certainly raises an awareness for officers, yes, for their safety.
And that's because that's that suspect's sort of space, right? The officer doesn't know what's in the car or in the apartment during a domestic situation. You're walking into someone else's territory, so to speak, right?
Yes.
Right. And so there could be guns, there could be knives, there could be any number of instruments that could bring harm to a police officer, right?
There's that potential.
Now, obviously, there's tens of thousands of traffic stops, and there's not every traffic stop turns violent. I'm not suggesting that, but that does happen regularly. Agreed? That traffic stops turn violent.
Yes, they can.
For real.
So, when we're talking about the use of force policy under 5-301.01, the last sentence that wasn't read before is the force used shall be consistent with current MPD training.
Facts.
Agreed?
Yes.
Now, there's a difference between a policy change and like a best practice change. Would you agree with that?
Can you clarify?
Sure. So there are certain times where the policy.
The audio is oddly, suspiciously fucking up a lot today. I don't know why, but either way, don't matter. They're in the courtroom. They're hearing this shit. The jury's hearing this shit. They're typing this shit down, so I ain't even worried about it. But we gonna keep listening.
It's with respect to the use of force may specifically change to prohibit a particular style or use of force, right?
Yes.
So thinking about in the old days, officers used to wear like weighted gloves to make their punches more effective, right?
Yes.
The policy changed and prohibited that, correct?
Yes.
And then there's a difference between, say, the evolution of defensive tactics. Would you agree with that? I mean, the defensive tactics training you received in 1989 is much different than the defensive tactics training that's taught now, right?
Yes.
And I believe it was maybe 15 years ago that the Minneapolis Police Department started moving towards more body weight control, sort of this jujitsu training as opposed to physically striking people to gain compliance.
And are you referencing policy or training?
Training,
I believe so.
about 10, 15 years ago,
Yes.
agreed? And that was sort of highlighting the evolution, as you kind of described it in your direct examination, of policing since you've become a police officer. That's
Yes.
one way it's evolved.
Yes.
And when something changes per policy, can't wear weighted gloves anymore, for example, that's it, no more. Agreed?
Yes, I agree, yes.
He talking about
But if
teaching cops
the
jujitsu.
policy-
That makes
if
no sense. right?
training, for example, evolves into a best practice, it doesn't prevent an officer from learning a technique he learned earlier in his career. Just may not be the best practice anymore.
So I pause just
Facts,
to,
bars.
when you say that they're learning something, but if it's not in alignment with our policy, then that would not be prohibited, if I'm
Well,
hearing
so-
you correctly.
Let me try to explain. Like, so if an officer was trained in a particular handcuffing technique, and then they go to their defensive tactics training and they say, this is a better way to handcuff a suspect, it's not a policy change, it's just a best practice change. And they can still use the old way they did it.
It would, Counselor, it would have to be something that the training staff would have to, not just an officer saying, I want to do it this way, and, I mean, it's something that would have to be authorized through our training
So-
staff, yes.
So we could talk about that kind of thing with the training, the use of force defensive tactics training, right? That would be the better place to talk, better people to talk to about that.
Yes, yes.
Okay. All right. Now,
This dude's stupid
when we're
as fuck.
talking about active aggression and active resistance, sometimes those two things are happening simultaneously. Agreed?
It can be, yes.
Yeah, of course, because that's the narrative. See, I like that you brought that up. I wasn't even trying to pay attention to the media when they were doing that because I knew exactly what they were going to do with her. Khalil says, I'm still tripping off of how the lamestream media was trying to make George Floyd's girlfriend's testimony of them using drugs the story, more than the pig kneeling on his neck for 9 minutes. That's exactly what I knew they were going to do. And why I was like pissed at because like that's who the defense was waiting on. They were waiting on George Floyd's girlfriend to come in there and talk about the drugs that they used and who they got the drugs from and all this other shit. They were trying to dive deep and really, really hammer in the drug shit with her and have her slip up. And they defense dug in her motherfucking ass, bro. But still, that has nothing like, and that's another thing. The jury's still gonna look and you know, God bless her. I don't judge her at all, but I know the defense is just gonna look at her as somebody who's on drugs, and they're gonna dismiss her fucking testimony anyway. What is important though is the fact that the motherfuckers that this guy worked with is coming in there to say that he was wrong for what he did. Think about that. You had the lieutenant, the sergeant, and now the chief. High top tier. And the judge, now I was going to mention this earlier, the judge said this earlier during the trial that he was not trying to have any more officers or anybody else come in to do testimony because he didn't want to oversaturate the courtroom with asking questions to officers about what they would have did in the situation. But doesn't matter. We got key components of the department to come in here and literally put the nail in the coffin. In my opinion, I'm hoping that's the case. The defense struggling. They struggling.
Go back to.
The defense is struggling right now.
So now we were talking then about, again, the Graham versus Connor case and how that is incorporated into the Minneapolis Police Department policy. And I'm showing you Exhibit 217 now. It should be up in front of you. What we're basically talking about was a United States Supreme Court decision that outlined the objectively reasonable use of force standard, right?
Yes.
And Graham versus Connor is not limited to those three factors that you were read before, right? The Graham versus Connor analysis.
Yes, correct.
those are three that are kind of listed, but ultimately it's not an all-inclusive list of considerations for the reasonableness of the use of force. Agreed?
That would be my understanding, yes.
And in fact, what the policy reads is that the reasonableness of a particular use of force must be judged from the
That's funny,
perspective of the
Devontae.
reasonable officer on
You got to
the
go to my
scene,
page. I got plenty of videos.
rather
like this.
than with the 20/20 vision of hindsight, right?
Yes.
So we're looking at it in the instant and the moment based upon the objective standard, right?
Yes.
Now the policy also includes that the calculus
There are 15 jurors. I believe 9 of them are white.
of reasonableness must embody allowance for the fact that
was
police
strange.
officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense,
Actual runs.
uncertain,
I'm not
and
lying.
rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in a particular
Real runs.
situation, right?
Yes.
And that's because when officers go to a situation, kind of like what we
Let me pause the video because it's important for me to actually not miss any of this shit. But I will say, real runts on deck. Hold on, wait. I don't want y'all to get it mistaken. Don't get it mistaken. I don't know how well you can see it, but trust me, trust and believe me.
talked
Let's
about
get back.
before, what can be initially very minor can grow into something major. Agreed?
Yes.
Now to show you Exhibit 219. You read a part of 5-304, which is threatening the use of force and de-escalation. And I want to talk to you a little bit about de-escalation. Have you heard the term, sometimes you have to escalate to de-escalate? You ever heard that phrase?
I have not heard that.
Okay. So in here, you talk about, or the policy talks about, that officers shall consider
animal.
verbally announcing their intent to use force, including displaying an authorized weapon as a threat of force, right? So sometimes an officer has to take out his gun, say, hey, I mean, that's a use of force in that instance, right?
Yes.
And if you don't listen to me, I'm going to use force. It's a pretty clear indication that force could be used when you have a gun pointing at you. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
But other things such as chemical irritants or tasers, it's not limited to just a firearm, right?
Yes.
And so sometimes what an officer has to do is command the presence, right? They have to take control of the situation.
Yes.
And sometimes that's not particularly attractive, is it?
Could you explain?
Sure. The use of force is not something that people like to watch generally, right?
Objection, speculation, and argument.
Right.
Sustained.
Thank you.
Would you
What the fuck? Now here he goes trying to label the fucking crowd as dangerous now. He was about to start on it. He was about to get on it, but guess what? No, sorry, Bob. Objection.
agree that the use of
We're
force
not
is
going,
not
bitch.
an attractive notion?
I would say that use of force is something that most officers would rather not use. Yes.
Right. And
That's a lie, sir.
you described in your direct examination how
That's a lie.
the single greatest way that the Minneapolis Police Department could be judged is based upon how the public perceives its use of force.
Yes.
Right? So it has a tendency to garner a lot of attention.
It can.
So much so that citizens have become more prone to record observed interactions with police, right?
Yes.
Something that you didn't have to deal with back in 1989, right?
Yes.
So essentially what this policy 5-304 in terms of threatening the use of force, it's contained within this de-escalation concept, right? So sometimes you have to display a weapon to gain command so that you can de-escalate, right?
Yes.
Now, when we're talking about, is it fair to say that pretty much every single one of these use of force of policies contains some phrase, if reasonable or if practical? There's limitations on the use of force, right?
Yes, there are limitations, yes.
And
You can't-
and it's situation by situation, right?
Yes.
And then again, if we go back and look at the language of the Graham versus Connor and the policy that's contained by Minneapolis Police Department, it's the use of force has no precise, objective, singular rule. It's different in every case.
Yes.
So for example, in the de-escalation policy 5-304B1, de-escalation is advisable when it is safe and feasible, correct?
Yes.
And sometimes de-escalation, again, includes the use of force, right? The use of force can be a
I see what you did there,
de-escalation
Khalil.
tactic.
I was, in council, I was thinking of your example of displaying your weapon. And so I don't have a lot of knowledge in terms of physical force being used to actually de-escalate a situation. But the threatening use of force or threatening verbally, I'm more familiar with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So again, if we were to talk to the
Nah.
use of force or defensive tactics,
Objection, argumentative,
Overruled.
they would be the best source of that.
objection, argumentative.
Overruled.
Yes.
But the purpose
See, now he getting all the overrules because the judge know that the defense is trash and he losing this case. But
of de-escalation,
going.
agreed, is to attempt to slow down or stabilize the situation so that more time, options, and resources become available to the officer.
Yes.
Basically, slow down, everybody kind of calm down, let's try to relax, right?
Yes.
But it's a lot more, the process of de-escalation is not just trying to talk somebody out of doing something. There are actions that are important, there may be reactions that are important, and the de-escalation policy includes some examples of those things, right?
Yes.
Such as placing barriers between an uncooperative subject and an officer.
Yes.
And sometimes those barriers are another officer, right?
Yes.
Containing a threat, right? I mean, that's one of the examples in policy.
Yes.
By containing a threat, that can include physically restraining someone so that they don't upset another person, right?
Yes.
Or cause another person to have a violent reaction towards them or officers, right?
Yes.
Moving from a position that exposes officers to potential threats to a safer position, right? So kind of retreating in certain circumstances.
Yes.
Reducing exposure to a potential threat using distance, cover, or concealment, right? So hiding, say, behind a squad car, right?
Yes.
Avoiding physical confrontation. That's probably a pretty big one, right?
Yes.
And using verbal techniques to calm an agitated subject or promote rational decision making. That's kind of down towards the end.
Yes.
it's funny that he's bringing this up because I know for a fact, and I know a lot of y'all who've had encounters with police officers know that they don't do anything about de-escalating shit. Now, I've told this story before. Me and my homeboys was driving in Minneapolis. Now, the same department. We're driving to Minneapolis, going to a friend's house. We're trying to find a park. Anybody that knows, if you're trying to find a park in the city, in any city, in anybody's neighborhood on the weekend, it's packed. So we trying to find a park, and on top of that, it's the wintertime. So like the snow plays a factor, all that shit. So we circling the block trying to find a park. We find one finally, but like as we circling the block, there's a cop that comes behind us because he sees us circling the block trying to like do whatever. We finally find a park. We get there. he pulls like kind of behind us, but has his lights off, his headlights off. And it's all dark in his car and shit. So we all get out and we start walking down the street. This motherfucker, and I noticed him just sitting there, like lights off, all that shit. And as we're walking past, I lean down. I bend down. I look at his window. I said, "Hey," I waved him down. He rolled his window down a little bit. I was like, "Hey, is there a problem?" He said, "Get the fuck out of here." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And I just kept walking because I knew what the fuck that was. I knew that he wanted me to snap back. He was like, "Oh, he looks like an angry nigga. Let me say some shit to trigger him and see what he says back. Give me a reason to get the fuck out the car." Nope. You're not gonna get me. I ain't stupid. I know shit before I see shit. I call shit before it happens. I already know. Motherfucker, these motherfuckers are dirty out here. And they fucked up. And they look for confrontation. That's what they want. They don't try to de-escalate shit.
And lastly, calling additional resources. Right?
Yes.
Oh yeah, it definitely will, but we gonna hope that he's not found innocent.
And we talked about Exhibit 230.
You don't know what he want to do.
Showing you Exhibit 230, which is the emergency
That's
medical
exactly what it is.
response. You'd agree that the policy requires Minneapolis police employees to request an emergency medical service as soon as practical, right?
Yes.
If a person comes into contact having an acute medical crisis, and any delay in treatment could potentially aggravate the severity of the medical crisis, right?
Yes.
So sometimes officers will call for EMS, not thinking it's a major issue. When suddenly it becomes apparent, they can step up or request a quicker response from EMS, right?
Yes.
And that is something that an officer can do to ensure the medical treatment of
Minneapolis
the
police.
suspect that they have, or the
You goddamn
person
right.
that they're in contact with, right?
Counselor, to ensure, to ensure.
Sorry, it's been a long week. To ensure.
Hey, I'll speak to that real quick. Just real quick. I'm sorry for pausing the video again, but he said they're still fucking up Minneapolis, guilty or not. They're going to give the police hell. I believe that if he's found guilty, that people are going to turn up, but not in the way that people think. Like, it's going to be more celebration than anything. And I feel like a lot of the leaders that have been leading a lot of the marches and the protests and shit are going to make sure that they steer people in the right direction without having to do anything like fucking crazy or tragic or anything like that. And he said crime's increasing as we speak. Well, that's because a lot of the police officers don't feel like they have the support of the people when people saying defund the police, and they're not doing their job. So crime's increasing because they're not doing their fucking job. The police say fuck it. So I mean, that's just what they've been on since all the shit that happened last year. Like if nobody knows out there besides us who live here, like me and JR and shit and a few other people, besides that, like, people really don't understand. Like, they've been talking about the fact that crime has been increasing over here in Minneapolis, but it's because the police literally, they don't give a fuck. And they not fucking with the people because they feel like everybody's like, fuck y'all. So just please keep that shit in mind.
The medical condition of the suspect to help with that.
Yes.
Right. Get EMS there as quickly as is possible. Right?
Yes.
Now we didn't talk about the maximal restraint technique. You're familiar with the policies surrounding that?
Yes.
I'm going to show to you what's been admitted as Exhibit 225. Can you describe what the maximal restraint technique is?
Yes, Counselor, the maximal restraint technique has often been referred to as the hobble. And that is a It's a method of if officers are dealing with typically a combative or aggressive person, in order to protect them or even property, it's placing, basically attaching a cord of the legs to the waist, so that the individual, does not have free movement of their legs. So it's securing them again, usually by their ankles. If you're prone, bringing that up to your waist and securing it. The maximal restraint technique, or the hobble, though, if it's used, a supervisor has to respond to the scene. You cannot transport anyone prone in that position due to the risks of the breathing. But that is Counselor, that would be my understanding of the MRT, or the maximal restraint technique.
So you talked a little bit in terms of the use of force, how officers are kind of
He got off that quick.
reevaluating their use of force from time to time, right? They
Yes.
should be, at least, right? And so if officers decide to use the maximal restraint technique and then decide, hey, we know, and then later decide not to use it, right? That is kind of adjusting that use of force.
I would, Counselor, with some clarity, I don't know if what I mean by that is, if you were to have a person
He's got to get minimum 10 or
handcuffed and
more.
prone
10 or
on their
more.
stomach on the ground and pavement, and you had two officers, let's say, securing their legs to the back of the waist, you in a way are still employing what that technique is about anyway. So there can be some variances to that.
Sure.
If that makes sense.
It does. So let's assume that you've got two officers pulling
Always
the
wanna
legs forward,
assume.
essentially employing that aversion, so to speak, of the maximal restraint. But then they release and they say, we're not gonna hobble this person. We're not gonna employ the MRT. You're going from a decision to employ that technique backwards down the continuum in terms of the use of force. Would you agree with that?
And Counselor, I just because these types of uses of force can be problematic in terms of there's a high risk to them. So meaning that if you're going to take that initiative to do that alternative version in the first place, you'd want to get a hold of a supervisor, because something could happen in terms of that person. And so
I'm not,
I just wanted, yeah.
I'm not asking in terms of the policy. I'm asking in terms of sort of the use of force and the critical decision-making model, right? You described how the use of force, you have to go through this critical decision-making model. How much force am I going to use? And sometimes you have to back off the use of force. Agreed?
Yes.
And sometimes you have to go forward with the
Hitman,
use of
what's
force,
up?
meaning you use even more force,
Yes.
right? And it's this constant reevaluation. Agreed?
Yes.
And so when you have officers who make a decision that the facts and circumstances would warrant using the hobble device, but then later decide not to employ that device, that is that critical decision-making model in action. Agreed?
Yes.
And it would be a reduction in the use of force. It may still require supervisors to be on scene, policy-wise, but it is a reduction in the use of force. Agreed?
And Counselor, are we talking specifically the events of May 25th?
I'm talking
Or
generally.
In general, yes.
But you would agree, ultimately, that all of the Minneapolis Police Department policies relevant to the use of force, emergency medical response, emergency medical treatment, all of these policies are, by their very language, are situationally dependent, right? They all say, if the circumstances allow, if time permits, if it's safe. They have a qualifier to them. Agreed?
Yes, I would agree with that.
To show you Exhibit 231.
The defense is so fucking trash, man. So trash. These guys, they're
which is
trying
at
so
the,
fucking
at the
hard.
bottom of Exhibit 231 is the crisis intervention policy. And the second page includes the definition. Could you read the entire definition of what a crisis is?
Yes. An event or situation where an individual's safety and health are threatened by behavioral health challenges to include mental illness, developmental disabilities, substance use, or overwhelming stressors. A crisis can involve an individual's perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds the individual's current resources and coping mechanisms and may include unusual stress in his or her life that renders him or her unable to function as he or she normally would. The crisis may,
What up,
but not
Spank? You right, though.
necessarily,
You right.
result in an upward trajectory or intensity culminating in thoughts or acts that are possibly dangerous to himself, herself, and or others.
All right. So generally speaking, again, not relevant to the May 25th of 2020 incident. We'll get there in a minute. But when we talk about a general police response, sometimes the police may respond to something and the person they're dealing with is not in a crisis. Agreed?
Yes.
But other people may be perceiving what is happening and it could become a crisis to that person.
What the fuck
If you
is
can
he
rephrase.
talking? Look how
Sure.
stupid he fucking
People-
looks. Look how fucking stupid he looks. What type of shit is he talking about? Get to the May 25th shit. That's why he asked that. Because what are we even what are you talking about? What are you talking about? This dude is stupid as fuck.
People who observe, would you say that people who observe police interactions with people, especially the more physical or use of force types, that could turn into a crisis for an observer?
Objection irrelevant.
Sustained is calling for speculation.
Irrelevant.
So in
Motherfucker.
terms of the definition of crisis,
Come on.
a crisis may involve an individual's perception or experience of an event or situation as an intolerable difficulty that exceeds that individual's current resources and coping mechanisms, right?
Yes.
That doesn't necessarily mean that you are the person with whom you are
Shout out to
arresting
Devontae Hill for
or having
subscribing.
contact with is going to be the person who will experience the crisis. Agreed?
Objection irrelevant.
Overruled.
In concert, just respectfully, so you're saying that the person who's witnessing a situation with the officers, that situation may cause them to be in crisis?
Correct.
Could potentially.
Right. And the crisis may, but not necessarily, result in an upward trajectory or intensity culminating in thoughts or acts that are possibly dangerous to him, her, or others. Right?
In counselor, just this is the person who's watching this.
Right.
It could.
So people are watching with something that they appear to believe or they believe is wrong or contrary to police policy that may cause them to get upset, and that level of upsetment or that level of volatility may
Ridiculous.
grow throughout the course of the interaction.
Objection irrelevant. Calls for speculation and beyond the scope.
Overruled. It's within the scope.
It could.
Because ultimately, part of the training that Minneapolis police officers have to go through is how to deal with crowds who observe police interactions, right?
Yes.
Crowds that may be upset with police interaction, right?
Yes.
I mean, there are classes through the training academy, there are classes through in-service specifically dealing with how to deal with crowd control, right?
Yes.
And all of this is to revert, in part, back to that de-escalation process as well, right?
Yes.
So part of it as a crowd.
If you want to de-escalate a crowd, How is continuing to do something that the crowd is hating at the moment de-escalating it? So exactly what I'm talking about right now, this motherfucker is dumb as fuck. And he's bringing up the dumbest examples in the world. Generally speaking, he's a fucking idiot. If we're talking about de-escalating a situation, especially being a police officer when it's not just him, like he's making it seem like it was just Chauvin and George Floyd and then a crowd of people who didn't like what he was doing. There were 4 officers there. And the one officer, Tao, funny how his name is Tao and he's short as fuck. You ain't too Tao. He wasn't even trying to de-escalate the situation. He was making it worse. His whole point, like I'm talking about, all this shit is caught on video. So everything that he's saying right now is just it's just stupid as fuck. What are we speculating when there's video?
It grows or becomes more upset. Part of it is to try to de-escalate, which can involve trying to avoid a physical confrontation, right?
Yes, it could. Yes.
Trying to stay safe, concealed, and covered, right?
Yes.
Not yelling back at somebody, not engaging with them verbally, right?
Yes.
And sometimes when an officer tries to de-escalate a situation and someone is so upset, right? Sometimes they don't hear what the officer tells them. Would you agree with that?
Objection, speculation.
That calls for speculation. It is sustained.
Is it possible, generally speaking, that someone's own crisis may prevent them from hearing what an officer is telling them?
That could happen.
Hold on. The objection is sustained. The answer will be stricken.
So you testified that you've watched the body cameras, correct?
Yes.
He said, "Oh fuck, I'm done for, fam." I am done for. Fuck.
I'm going to show you, I don't know. Mr. Slisher, this is exhibit 1008,
Fucking dummy.
which is a 10-second, approximately 5-second clip of Alexander King's body-worn camera. It's already in, and I gave you a copy of it.
Is this in evidence?
Not yet, no. I'm just telling you, first and foremost, that's what it is. I'm going to show you on your screen a short clip of a video to see if this would be contained in what you've watched. And I need to...
That boy is sweating.
You would agree that that appears to be taken from one of the officer's body cameras, May 25th, 2020, at approximately 20:25 and 33 seconds.
Yes.
In, again, watching it without sound. Do you, at this point, did you see what appeared to be a reflection in the back of the squad car there?
Counselor, I did not.
Okay.
And it might just be because of the brevity of the video, but
Yeah, it's unfortunate. If you look in the upper left-hand corner at the bumper of the squad video.
The cursor to circle it for him.
I'm sorry?
Use the cursor, the stylus to...
Oh, sure. Sorry. Forgot all this fancy technology here.
Oh, shut the fuck up. You just stupid. I can't stand this guy.
You see the legs of someone in reflecting?
yes.
And so you would agree that this appears to be a short clip from one of the officer's body-worn cameras on May 25th of 2020.
Yes.
You've seen these before. You see what appears to be Mr. Floyd's arm there by the back of the squad car, right?
Yes.
So I would offer Exhibit 1008.
Any objection?
No objection.
1008 is received.
And if I may publish. Come over here.
Up on the sidewalk.
Yeah, we need you to do some distance. Sorry, didn't mean to reply. Do you hear a voice say we've got an ambulance coming?
Yes.
Oops, sorry, if we could take that down.
What is the point?
Now, policy 5-311. Let's talk a little bit about 5-311, which is the neck restraint policy. Get rid of this.
Council, would you stand there for a second?
They was losing it, man. The fucking judge had to come in and save his own people. See, I don't think the judge is really on. I think the judge is on the defense side. The way he's been acting, the way he's been moving, the way that he tried to check one of the witnesses. What was her name again? Genevieve Hanson.
Good time to break for our 20-minute mid-afternoon break. We'll reconvene around
yeah.
3:20. Thank you.
Oh yeah, you gonna break, huh? Of course you gonna break. Of course they break. It's smart for him to break.
Agree it appears to be the same time frame?
Yes.
All right. Now, lastly,
We don't take no
Chief,
breaks.
I'm going to show you one last video. We can take this down, Your Honor. I would offer Exhibit 1020, which is a side-by-side of the two.
Any objection?
No objection.
1020 is received.
And permission to publish. Pardon? Oh,
The union. I'm not surprised. That's what they do for their people. Don't matter if they fucking guilty.
I just started it over, if that's okay.
The
You would
defense is
agree,
struggling.
Chief, that from the perspective of Miss Frazier's camera, it appears that Officer Chauvin's knee is on the neck of Mr. Floyd.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
It's over. If I was Derek Chauvin, I feel like it was over right now. I feel like my life is over now. I feel like, damn, my defense really just fucking blew it today. And
Would you
last
agree
week.
that from the perspective of Officer King's body camera, it appears that Officer Chauvin's knee was more on Mr. Floyd's shoulder blade?
Yes.
I have no further questions.
He act like he ended with something like with a bomb or some shit.
Mr.
I have
Sush.
no further questions.
Thank you, Your Honor. Chief, let's start with what you just saw, and you testified that the particular moment in time that you were viewing Officer King or former Officer King's body-worn camera, it appeared at that moment in time that the knee of the defendant was more towards the shoulder blade. Is that right?
That is correct.
That was at a time where the ambulance had already arrived,
Yes.
very shortly before they loaded Mr. Floyd onto the gurney. Is that right?
That is correct.
And in your view of the body-worn camera footage and everything you reviewed prior to testifying today, did you see the defendant's knee anywhere but the neck of Mr. Floyd up until that time?
That is correct.
Boom.
And so the knee of the defendant was on Mr. Floyd's neck up until the time you just pointed out.
Yes, when I viewed that video portion, that is the first time that I'd seen the knee of the defendant on the shoulder blade area.
And that was right before the paramedic came.
That is correct.
Now,
Because that's still their
looking
people.
and talking about the neck
It's a
restraint
clan.
policy, if you would show Exhibit 17, please. Oh. So, looking at Exhibit 17, was it your testimony that Exhibit 17 is not a trained MPD neck restraint?
Correct, that is my testimony.
And I'd like you to reflect on the exhibits that you were shown by defense counsel, exhibits 1008, 1019, and 1020, the 10-second clip. Okay? During that period of time, which is much later than the point in time we see here, did you see any indication that Mr. Floyd was actively resisting, as that term is defined in Minneapolis Police Department policy?
I did not observe Mr. Floyd to be actively resisting during that time.
Did you see, same question, same time period, any indication that Mr. Floyd was being actively aggressive during that 10-second clip that you were just shown?
No, I did not observe Mr. Floyd to be actively aggressive during that short video.
Could you even say that he was passively resisting at that time that you were shown those exhibits?
No. As a matter of fact, as I saw that video, I didn't even know if Mr. Floyd was alive at that time.
Wow. Wow. Big. Very bigly. That was very bigly.
I want to revisit a little bit of the testimony on cross-examination about the use of the MRT or the hobble, right? And if I'm to understand your testimony, you indicated that a hobble is a strap that's used to connect a handcuffed person, their waist, the arms, and the legs to restrain them. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And what I thought I heard you saying in response to questioning by counsel was that you can do an MRT effectively, right, without using a hobble when you're doing the same thing but with your hands.
Yes, that is correct.
And did I understand your testimony to essentially be that that's what these officers were doing, was essentially using the maximal restraint technique but not using the hobble?
That is correct.
And pursuant to departmental policy, the hobble is the only authorized way to employ the maximal restraint technique. Is that right?
That is correct.
You aware that the use of the actual hobble requires a supervisor to report to the scene and do a force report?
Yes, the supervisor must arrive at the scene and do a report.
Shit.
But that would be avoided if the hobble itself wasn't used, or?
No, if you're still employing that sort of technique, again, with a prone individual handcuffed, and you're basically doing that maneuver, and because of the severity of risk to, and certainly that would have been to Mr. Floyd, you would have contacted a supervisor.
And aside from that, I mean, if you're using an MRT, you are supposed to adhere to departmental policy. Is that
Damn,
right?
Jay.
That is correct.
And
It's gonna
the
be worth it though, brother.
Minneapolis departmental policy for the use of the MRT requires an officer to do what as soon as the MRT is applied?
Again, because of the severe nature of making sure that that individual can breathe, we have to get that individual into a side recovery position to make sure that their airway is not obstructed. And so that's paramount.
So, and that's required by policy, and the side recovery position is supposed to be instant, is that right?
Immediate.
And you indicated that it has to do with breathing. You're familiar with the term positional asphyxia?
I am.
Is that one of the dangers of leaving somebody in a prone, handcuffed position for too long?
Yes, positional asphyxia. We again, as I mentioned, we cannot transport people in that position if they're prone to handcuffed and there's pressure around their airways or on their back. The risk and potential for them and us killing them goes up substantially. So that side recovery position is very critically important.
I want to follow up on some of the questions about your own personal training and that of different officers in different roles within the Minneapolis Police Department. Different officers can attend other types of training, is that right?
Yes,
But everybody's required to do in-service training, is that true?
that is correct.
And regardless of where somebody trains, I mean, the rules are the rules, right?
Yes,
And the policy applies to all MPD officers.
yes.
Correct.
The question was posed regarding the critical decision-making model and the need to take in information. And that's true, correct?
Yes.
But when we're looking at the proper and authorized use of force under departmental policy, is it fair to say that the amount of force an officer can use depends upon the conduct of the subject, the person upon whom the force is being used?
Yes, it's fair to say that.
So, for example, if you had me in, let's say, a dangerous hold, right, would you be able to continue to keep me in a dangerous hold based on something somebody else is doing?
I'm sorry, if you could explain that, I'm sorry.
So, for example, if you found the need to place me in some sort of a hold that's dangerous,
Yes,
but something that you see, say the judge is starting to pick something up to throw at me, would that justify you using more force on me?
no.
Let's go. This is why the prosecution is so lit, bro, because every time the defense comes up there and says some goofy ass shit, they come in and destroy that shit. What did I say earlier? Now, I know I can't be a lawyer because I'll be in there cussing motherfuckers out daily and calling them stupid as fuck all the fucking time. But what did I say as soon as the defense said some stupid ass shit about trying to fucking apply force to somebody and then having a crowd do something, crowd control? Like, how do you de-escalate a crowd by using more force on the person that is on the ground that they're telling you you're killing? If you're aggravating people, imagine that. If you're sitting there punching somebody in the face and people are like, yo, stop punching them, you're killing them, and you're looking at them like, yo, calm down, and you still punch them in the fucking face, they're going to get more fucking aggravated. That shit is fucking crazy. I can't believe the defense thought that would even be an argument. How do you result in using more force on somebody who is fucking dying and motionless?
And in terms of
To control the crowd.
de-escalating the crowd, you indicated that there
Listen.
is some potential need to de-escalate a crowd, a group of people. Is that right?
Yes.
Because a group of people can experience something that they find shocking or upsetting, and that can, place them in some kind of an emotional state. Is that right?
That's correct.
Hell yeah.
And you may need to turn your attention to and de-escalate the crowd.
Yes.
Would one way, if we can show Exhibit 17, would one way to de-escalate the crowd who's experiencing something shocking to stop doing the thing that's shocking them?
Absolutely.
I have nothing further.
Any recross?
Thank you. Very briefly, just one question. There are certain circumstances where an officer
is
has to kind of freeze the situation, evaluate, hold the person until he or she can decide what's the safest way to move forward. Agreed?
Agreed.
Sometimes you just have to kind of hold the person, correct?
Yes.
And that's something that happens fairly frequently. Agreed?
Yes.
And so, one other question with respect to the policy regarding the maximal restraint technique and putting a person in the recovery position or the side recovery position. You said it was immediate. Agreed?
As soon as you're able to do so, yes.
And that's actually what the policy says, is as soon as you're able to do so, right?
Yes.
And there are certain circumstances under which you may be using force where the force has to be dealt with before you can turn your attention to rendering medical aid, right?
And Counselor, just so that, are we still talking about someone in the recovery position or the hobble?
Just
Or
generally.
can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Sure. There are certain circumstances where a use of force needs to be continued for some reason to deal with something else before you can deal or render medical aid.
You looking at this man like a
Let
fucking
me
dummy.
give you an
Yeah.
example. We're in a gun battle.
He said his
right?
caucasoid
You and
about
I
to
are
be
shooting
holding
at each
Tay
other.
pocket
I'm the
in
cop,
general
you're the
population.
bad guy, and you hit my partner. I'm going to continue to use my force against you before I can go render medical aid.
Counselor, in that hypothetical, yes.
I disagree, MLK. Our aim must be to support the black man and always support the black man in everything the black man does. We are here on this earth dealing with the evils of white supremacy. Everybody knows this, but people like to turn a blind eye because motherfuckers don't like to pay attention or understand. You must understand that we have been dealing with the oppression and the suppression and the equal amount of separation between us and the evils in this goddamn country. We will never be friends and understand unless people try. And lately, people have not tried. It is 2021. It is 2021. They still don't understand.
Thank you.
Briefly.
Sometimes it's necessary to freeze a scene and to hold an individual, correct?
Yes.
But you have to do so safely. You have to hold the person safely. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
Nothing further.
All right, thank you, Chief. You're
Your Honor,
excused.
thank you so much.
Next witness.
And that's what it is. The chief came on and did his motherfucking thing. He handled his motherfucking business. Trust me. He said your arrogance is only eclipsed by your ignorance. He doesn't understand me yet. He's new. I don't know this guy. What is his name? Alcidian. He puts another MLK quote because they love to put MLK as like the poster child for everybody black. Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. Okay. It is usually futile to try to talk facts and analysis to people who are enjoying a sense of moral superiority in their ignorance. We appreciate you for coming here. But your quotes don't mean anything. Your quotes don't mean anything to me. But I appreciate you being here and commenting for real. I really do. Thank you for popping up on the channel. We always have one or two people. But I sincerely and I honestly and I wholeheartedly, I really mean this from the heart. I really, really mean this from the heart. I don't give a fuck. All right. So anyway, Derek Chauvin got his life flashed before his eyes today in court. The police chief came in here and did what he was supposed to do. He did his job, just like the sergeant and the lieutenant did last week. You got to understand, this is something that is special, man. Something that is special for the entire court case, for the jurors to hear and all that. Like, I love the fact that the prosecution comes through and fucking just annihilates any contradiction that the fucking defense has, because you can literally pick holes in everything that they're trying to do. They deal with more hypotheticals than they do the actual fucking case. So we have to give it up to the chief for, you know, coming in here and doing what he was supposed to do. That's going to leave an impact on the jury, and hopefully in the next few weeks when this shit wraps the fuck up, we will see what we want to see. Because there's third degree hanging over his head. Do you guys know the maximum or the minimum of third degree is 25? So we gonna see, man. We gonna see. We gonna see if the jury gonna hold us down. Now, as always, how I end the stream, I'm going to shout out everybody that was in the comments, man. I'm about to shout everybody out. First and foremost, I need y'all to leave a GMS in the comments for me. I really need y'all to do that for me if you really fuck with me. Also, hit the like button if you haven't. Hit the subscribe. Hit the fucking bell. We're going to be going live every single day. You got to catch my streams every day, man. We be breaking a bunch of shit down, man. The trial, fucking current events, all the shit that's trending in the shit that I care about that's trending out here. Y'all gotta fuck with me on this channel, man. So as we close this motherfucker out, I am going to play some shit, and I'm going to shout y'all motherfuckers' names out as we leave this motherfucker. Let's go. Let's go. Shout out my moderator, JR Miller. Shout out JG, another moderator. He's a new moderator. Shout out to Cookies and Cream. I don't know where you from, but you said you was somewhere where it was late, and you gonna watch the stream in the morning, so I appreciate you. I hope you have a good fucking night. So shout out to Cookies and Cream. Motherfucker, shout out to another moderator, J Monte. Shout out to Cliff Dan. Shout out to Ish Bay. Shout out to Isha Boo. Shout out to Ben Slim, my nigga. What's happening? Shout out to Bars to Market. Shout out to Pineal Heart. Shout out to you. I ain't seen you in a minute. Pop up on me. Shout out to Khalil Dye. Real big shout out to Khalil, man. Khalil was real engaged today, man. I fuck with you, man, for real. Shout out to Khalil. Shout out to Devontae Hill, new subscriber, man. Appreciate you for subscribing to the channel, man. We trying to get to 1,000. Trying to get to 1,000 wow. So motherfucking share this shit, man. Share the channel with your peoples, man. Let them know where to come to every single day for the streams. 3 p.m., man. I'm going to try to do it every day at 3 p.m. around this time. So make sure you catch me in the afternoon. Black Man America, shout out to you. Hey, shout out to Bass C ENT. We with you. We with you. Shout out to Hitman X. Shout out to Spank Loke Pimpin'. I see y'all motherfuckers, man. Shout out to J Monte. Shout out to Orion. Shout out to Stizlamic. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Shout out to all y'all, man. I really appreciate y'all for popping up on me, man. Showing some motherfucking love, man. Appreciate y'all, man. Keep that GMS. Keep that GMS. He said 1 dislike for Mr. MLK quoter. Yeah, I didn't see no dislikes until after he came. Oh, Bianca, you just made it. You just made it. You're going to have to rewind this motherfucker if you want to. I don't know, but catch me tomorrow, too. I'll be live again. Yeah. Hey. The beat that I'm playing is from my beat album, so go ahead and get the beat album, man. You see the link in the motherfucking comments. Post that shit again, JR, if you still in this motherfucker. Post the link in the comments and let these people know where to get GMS Episode 1, GMS Episode 2, GMS Episode 3. They are all beat albums, and they're all fucking fire. You can go cop them motherfuckers on bandcamp.com and then search Black GMS, BLACKK GMS, all one word, on bandcamp.com. Fuck with me, man. I appreciate y'all. Y'all have a good night.